Welcome to the third and final lecture in our Fall Faculty in Focus series. I'm Freyja Hartzell, Assistant Professor of History of Design. I don't know what I am. Assistant Professor of the History of Modern Design, Architecture, and Art. And my current research revolves around this semester's topic of dolls and human likeness. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Heidi Boisvert, and to invite her to help us push the boundaries of how we understand the doll as both object and concept. Heidi is an interdisciplinary artist, experience designer, creative technologist, and academic researcher who integrates the neurobiological and sociocultural effects of media and technology. She studies the role of the body, the senses, and emotion in human perception and social change. Heidi's also an assistant professor of AI and the arts at the University of Florida, and she's a senior research fellow at the Norman Lear Center, a research affiliate in the Open Documentary Lab at MIT, and a member of New Inc.'s Creative Science track. In addition to tonight's talk, Heidi and I will be hosting a more casual long table event for the BGC community here in the lecture hall at 12:30, 12:15, sorry, 12:30 my calendar. I guess I better not be late. 12:15 tomorrow, and we invite you to stop by for that and drop in and join the conversation for as short or as long as you'd like. Please join me in welcoming Heidi Boisvert.
Hello, everybody. Just want to thank Andrew and Freyja for inviting me, and also to Nadia and Laura for kindly arranging all of the logistics. I guess I probably don't need to introduce myself. Actually, my presentation just went off because Freyja did that, so I'm going to bypass that screen and start in a different place. So, okay. So I guess the only thing I would like to say, because I'm going to contextualize the talk, is just give you a little bit of kind of like a history of how I've arrived at the work that I'm doing now. So I did want to share that in addition to starting this center, this AI and Art Center at the University of Florida, I'm also the founder of Future Perfect Lab. And Future Perfect Lab is a creative agency and think tank, and it harnesses the power of pop culture, emerging technology, and neuroscience to ignite social change. So, for the past 15 years or so, I've actually been dedicated to transforming what I would call toxic narratives through playful and imaginative experiences with the single aim of building a more just and pluralist universe, one that is not only where everybody belongs, but is thriving. So I'm part of a nationwide network of artists, media makers, social justice organizations, researchers, writers, and showrunners who believe in the power of culture change to create profound shifts in how people think, feel, and act or behave in the world. And we believe that specific pop culture stories shaped by narrative archetypes carry mental models into mass culture and gradually spark inciting experiences that compel new behavioral instincts. So, in my creative practice, I catalyze this spark by engineering social justice messages for mass appeal through a multi pronged feedback loop consisting of playful and imaginative creative experiences, empirical media effects research, and this is supported by co creation workshops and open source tool building. I'm not going to talk about all of those things tonight, but I just want to give you some context for the work that I'm making and the other aspects that actually inform that practice. But on the creative side, I co-create inventive multimedia experiences in partnership with social justice organizations and media influencers through multiple touch points using games, VR and AR, transmedia storytelling, interactive web, locative media, theater, and more. So this could take the form of an alternate reality game on Facebook to promote human rights, featuring celebs like Victor Garber here, where the player is an agent for the Council on American Heritage. Could be an animation to raise awareness about unfair immigration laws by teledeporting Spock, which is often played before like feature films and movie theaters. or a location-based augmented reality app to change perceptions around homelessness while simultaneously raising funds to move individuals into actual homes. However, after making this work for many, many years, I had a crisis of faith. I began to wonder whether, these approaches to changing hearts and minds were actually effectual, or more importantly, I actually began to worry whether or not the empathetic care that I was trying to cultivate was actually being disrupted through the actual technologies I was using, so that the technology itself, which was eroding particular areas in the brain, were actually harmful in some sense. So while we are not yet synthetic full body prothesis, augmented cybernetic humans tethered to cables like Major here in Mamamura Oshii's Ghost in a Shell, our dependence upon intelligent technology is what I would call a slow form of violence, rescripting our nervous systems and quietly taking over both our cognitive and our affective faculties and literally changing the structure of our brain. So this concern, my concern about human beings becoming almost like APIs, essentially what I see as almost programmable dolls run on scripts and protocols, brought up a lot of questions for me. And I somehow felt responsible because I had been making work with these creative technologies. So to tackle this, I decided to actually go back and do a PhD and study with cognitive neuroscientists in connection with the arts department to create empirical research into the effects of media and technology. In that process, I discovered that our current technologies, namely the internet, mobile devices, and now immersive displays and wearables, are eroding these particular areas of the brain, the amygdala and the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory consolidation. So memory consolidation, if you don't know, is kind of like a core brain function that allows us to create knowledge schemas to essentially make meaning in the world. And it also activates and regulates our emotion feeling cycles. So the shrinking gray matter of our brain reduces our capacity for empathy and also increases our fight and flight response and what I would call social emotional incompetence. So I'm not going to talk much about neuroscience after this, but I guess I'm trying to kind of contextualize and situate where some of the work that I've been doing comes from, and some of the ideas. So part of what I'm trying to understand is how did we actually get here? What were the critical inflection points? And more importantly, where are we going? So in order to understand this, I wanted to understand this so that I could actually intervene and change our current technological trajectory. So I started mapping the macro historical patterns by correlating Schumpeter's waves of technological innovation against the corresponding media types, what Neil Postman calls knowledge monopolies, and then also the discourses that kind of supported the media's diffusion, as well as the emergence of cybernetics. So what I'm trying to do right now is to ground cybernetics and to also talk about how that relates to dolls when we're talking about cyborgs, and then how I'm moving against that in some sense. I discovered that the emergence of cybernetics post-World War II revealed itself as a distinct teleological forking moment of disembodiment, actually, where we began to move from external colonization to internal colonization. So the kind of the taking over moving bodies across space versus kind of taking over our perceptual reality to some degree. I then noted that at each cybernetic wave that it aligned with the theoretical shift in cognitive science. And then I added a sixth wave, what I call the biological phase, which Czech economist Daniel Smahula predicts will peak around 2035. So we're not too far away from that. He believes we'll only become more dependent upon biotechnology, robotics, biomimicry, nanotechnology, and transhuman enhancement in the years to come. So digging a little further into history, I discovered that the aftermath of World War II witnessed the outgrowth of numerous institutions of social control in the United States, shame associated with the vulnerability of the body at the hands of mass annihilation, and the unpredictability of emotions that gave rise to fascism, fueled a need to create communication strategies and computational systems to manage human and social behavior. So cybernetics emerged as a result of a series of these convenings called the Macy conferences, which brought together an interdisciplinary group of primarily white men and Margaret Mead, which some say is kind of like a white man, but for the sole purpose of formulating central concepts for a theory of communication and control, applying equally to human, animals, and machines. But the unspoken intention was to radically transform the public's perception of human beings into information processing entities, essentially intelligent machines. The sustaining power of cybernetics, even today, and Catherine Hale suggests, was due to the strategic coordination of first a theory of information, which was Claude Shannon's bailiwick, a model of neural functioning that showed how neurons worked as information processing systems, which was Warren McCulloch's life work, computers that could process binary code, that could conceivably reproduce themselves, thus reinforcing biological systems, which was von Neumann's specialty, and then a visionary who could articulate the larger implications of the cybernetic paradigm and make clear its cosmic significance. And this was Norbert Wiener's contribution. But it wasn't just cybernetics. There were three interrelated social forces that coalesced to accomplish these three things: the rejection of the body, the regulation of emotions, and the canalization of our senses. So what we see are the emergence of cybernetics, which was from 46 to 53, was joined by the publication of the first diagnostic statistic manual, the DSM, in 1952, and modernism's influence on advertising during the same nascent years. Each possessed its own valence of control, but taken together, they contribute to redefining the experience of subjectivity. Cybernetics through, as I mentioned, the erasure of the body, behavioral psychology by regulating emotions, and Madison Avenue by canalizing the senses. It was believed that the eye was a direct pathway to the brain. So this, allows me to start thinking about the oculus and certain types of intentions around current technology we're using today. So as a result, we slowly migrated from presence, mutation, and randomness to absence, the hyperreal, and pattern. Essentially, information lost its body, its materiality. So, in How We Became Posthuman, Catherine Hales examines how and why the body became systematically erased in the construction of cyberspace in the posthuman. She argues that the deliberate erasure of embodiment is performed so that the intelligence becomes a property of formal manipulation of symbols rather than the inaction in the human life world. Furthermore, she asserts that leaving behind the materiality of the body, typically coded feminine, enabled the predominantly white male techno-scientific community to identify subjectivity with the rational mind, and traditionally coded male, and thereby devise for themselves a new body not born of woman that they imagined will be more suited for rational thought processes and immortal yearnings. So this kind of like unspoken liberal humanist impulse sought to radically transform the public's perception of human beings into information processing entities, essentially intelligent machines, through the fabrication of a pattern of recursive innovation to invoke a diacritic marker of technological determinism. How's everybody doing? Is this dense? I'm going to get to artwork soon. I'm just kind of setting some stuff up. Okay. I also took an opportunity. I don't usually talk like this. I usually just talk about my work. But then I was thinking, I was thinking about all of you and situated in this idea of working on material objects and things. And I was trying to think about, what is the value of materiality in a culture so extremely mitigated by technology? So this is kind of like where I oriented from. Okay. If it gets too dense, just like do some weird shake of your body or something. Okay, so by conceptualizing a theory of information, which postulated, actually, I might skip that part. Is that okay? Basically, what I was trying to get at here is that there's like an easy slippage between humans and machines that can apply across many disciplines in the way that they set up this discursive rhetoric. I guess I would say there was a rhetoric that was associated with cybernetics that allowed it to diffuse, and we're still dealing with the legacy of cybernetics today and what I would call its ethics. So anyway, so the cyborg was consciously constructed as a technological and cultural icon through science fiction literature and film to support this notion, right? This kind of cybernetic notion of control, quantification, and prediction, right? To reshape representations of the body. The ethical concerns around intelligent technology is certainly not new. The sphere of the machine overlords taking over the world has been present in stories since Irwan here. If you look at backwards, it says nowhere. In 1872. The novel is one of the first to explore ideas of artificial intelligence. It was influenced by Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which had come out in 1959, and the machines developed out of the Industrial Revolution. Specifically, the chapters entitled The Book of Machines explores the potentially dangerous ideas of machine consciousness and self-replicating machines based on natural selection. The use of a satirical utopia as a narrative device enabled the argument to go beyond the usual polemic between vitalism and mechanism. So, N. Catherine Hales illustrates that the subterranean anxieties about the integrity and diminishing agency of the subject under this kind of cybernetic paradigm, what Arthur Crocker coined the flesh-eating 90s, was communicated through popular speculative fiction. She juxtaposes Limbo from 1950, Do Androids Dream of Electronic Sheep in 68, and Snow Crash against these kind of contemporaneous stages of cybernetics to suspend the complex interplay of three competing contingent and embodied negotiations that led to the active and historically situated discursive construction of bodily obsolescence during the evolution of the techno-scientific development. So these kind of like techno-utopian fantasies were popularized by cyberpunk fiction and science fiction movies at the turn of the last century. For instance, in William Gibson's cult classic Neuromancer in 1984, we witness a fictional representation of what is referenced as the bodiless exaltation of cyberspace, where the biological body is experienced as a mere accident and inconvenience rather than as the inevitability of human life. So Case, a computer cowboy, regards his body as a meat machine to lug around his brain, the seat of consciousness, and pines for an imminent return to cyberspace, where you can throw yourself into high-speed drift and skid, totally engaged but set apart from it all. And all around you, made flesh in the maze of the black market. So data, a nod to genetic code, now assumes the role of original source, begetting the biological body, which now has become a prosthesis. So, of course, there's lots of films I'm sure you've heard, like Lawnmower Man, The Matrix, Ghost in the Shell, as I mentioned. But many of these, they primarily are looking at how brains, you're kind of uploaded to a network or you're jacked in some sense, into cyberspace. So this idea that the biological data is reduced to informational patterns is easily fused into something akin to ecstasy of the virtual, non-bodily sex. And it continues today, right? We have lots of examples, Westworld and others. So I'm getting to the end of the cybernetic part, so I appreciate your patience. The repeated motif of machines reconfiguring biological bodies into pure information, coupled with the privileging of cognition in the production of consciousness, held equal sway outside of the realm of speculative fiction and film during the 90s. So we have Kevin Kelly's Out of Control, the new biology of machines, Lee Silver's remaking Eden's, Cloning and Beyond in a Brave New World, and the costly research antics of Kevin I Am a Cyborg Warwick, attesting to the pervasiveness and diversity of cyber culture penetrating the everyday. But for the strongest influence on the current cybernetic resurgence, I'll just reference Marvin Minsky here, who basically, I think it's all in the quote here, Um, during this fifth conference on artificial intelligence, he persuasively argues that data from the mind is the most important part of the human body. A person is not a head, arms, or legs. That's trivial. A person is the very multiprocessor with million times in a million small parts, and these are arranged as 1,000 computers. The most important thing each person is about each person is data and the programs in the data that are in the brain. And someday you will be able to take all of the data and put it on a little disk and store it for 1,000 years and then turn it on again. You'll be alive in the fourth or fifth millennium. So here's another pivot. Um, so as an artist and creative technologist, I actually believe that I have a responsibility, and artists in general have a responsibility to not only reflect upon how present technology shapes our cultural values and social behavior, but to also anticipate and actively contribute to a counter discourse in design practices that challenges and transforms the trajectory of future technology. So the one way we can do this is, as Carolyn Jones suggests, she's urging us to take up technology in the service of aesthetics. In doing so, we can create like a shadow discourse through our practice. And we have many case studies of artistic interventions that challenge the prevailing cybernetic paradigm from the 1950s to the present to learn from. In some instances, the work functioned as experiences to think with, extending Jacques Derrida's phrase, objects to think with, while in other instances, technological experimentation led to the repurposing of instrumental applications, which catalyzed innovation, only to later be co-opted by the mainstream, which is a subject, it's a book that I'm really interested in writing, how as artists we invent all of these new things, but then big corporations come and take them, and it's happened to me. So here, counterculture serves as both a critique and a bridge, allowing a crossing over into new waves of innovation. So a couple examples. I'm not going to go into depth. I just thought I would show you kind of the breadth of from the 1950s and the various movements that occurred. So, and on the bottom here, you see these are kind of paired once again with these shifts in cognitive science and some of the theories associated with them that then inform the type of technologies that emerged at that time. So, for instance, in the 1950s, that was characterized by like feedback loops and information as signal and noise, circular causality, instrumental language, and quantification. So, there was already an interplay between cybernetics and art that could be understood in the context of both modernism and ongoing aesthetic experiments with duration, movement, and process. So, and then in the 60s and 70s, I'm sure many of you are familiar with EAT, electronic arts. So we had like Bell Labs collaborating with a lot of artists, and they had that amazing show at the Armory here. But there was kind of an obsessive focus upon reflexive language, autopoiesis, structural coupling, and system-environment relationships. And by the 60s, cybernetics had already been absorbed, as we know, right, into kind of popular imagination. And so, so I won't say too much more there. I would love to talk about, Gordon Pass work and other things, but I'm going to skip that. Oops, sorry. Let me just quickly say. And then in the 80s and 90s, what started to emerge, why there's such a shift here, is that we start to see an increasing availability of like domestic prosumer computer-based technologies. So it catalyzed this kind of almost what I would call a Precambrian explosion of experimentation with art and technology because of these the accessibility of some of these tools. So, and the last one, I'm very interested. This is kind of like my period where I'm interested in this idea of biomimicry and how do we actually restore autonomy to the autonomic nervous system again and that sort of thing. So it's much more informed. A relationship between the machinic and the organic is starting to surface. So, and I've written a bunch of more stuff here, but I think I'm going to shift to some of the creative works now. So I guess the main thing I want to say here is that about this period is that since the nervous system, which I believe is kind of like our internal architecture and how we process reality in some sense, it's at the level of kind of the subsensorial. What I was suggesting is that now we've moved into the subsensorial in terms of how technology is affecting us. So it's at that very same level, right, that we have the ability to intervene and to make work in that way. Yeah. So we can also, as artists, make work that mirror complex natural systems, that what I would call the internal milieu, to render visible the impacts and co-optation to return this kind of autonomy, right? So here's my pivot to some artwork. So like the artists that kind of came before me, in particular the artists from the 1990s, I use kind of what I would call applied media theory, which is kind of a method of engaging in formal experimentation with the media to generate critical discourses and new technologies. So I employ various emerging technology in my work to instead reify, right, the centrality of the body, affect, in our senses, and restore kind of like unpredictability, right, and sort of like the wonder. So taking all of those I'm using those technological systems, but I'm kind of turning them on their head. So my goal is really to like reject the social control, the quantification, the prediction, and like embrace what I would call human error, like the messiness of subjectivity in a way. So to do this, I first turned to large-scale network performance as an antidote to intelligent technology, to both re-stimulate what I perceived and what Marshall McLuhan refers to as our numbed biological self, and to restore autonomy, as I mentioned, to the autonomic nervous system. I started to bring people into physical spaces, into intimate physical spaces, even though they were immersive, to explore the role of the body plays in social change, by employing dance as almost like what I would call as a 3D experimental sandbox, and then also using biotechnology. So I have some videos in here, but I'm going to talk over them, so you won't hear the music, but I can talk about how the music was generated. So Radical Signs of Life was the first large-scale interactive multimedia performance I made. Through responsive dance, radical attempts to externalize the mind's non-hierarchical distribution of thought, music is generated from the dancer's muscles and blood flow via biophysical sensors that capture sound wave from the performer's bodies. This data triggered complex neural patterns based on biological algorithms to be projected onto multiple screens as 3D imagery. As the audience interacts with the images, they enter into a dialogue with the dancers. Conceptually, the piece was an embodied examination of self-organizing systems and the increasing disparity between the encroachment of biodata and the quiet discord of biomemory. So the work revealed kind of the dangerous legacy of cybernetics and awakened kind of like an urgent need to reinsert the body and affect back into technology before technology further embeds itself inside of us. So my collaborator, Marco Donnarumma, and I created these wireless prototypes of the X-Sense using custom wireless transmitters and Arduinos. Each dancer wore 2 sensors on different parts of the body to explore different sonic texture. And then the data was sent to Pure Data, PD, it's a generative music program, open source, where the signal was amplified and filtered. And then features were extracted from those signals and then remapped to musical and visual parameters. So then what we did is we sent the data over Open Sound Protocol to both processing, which creates generative images, and then to Maximus P to create a real-time recursive musical composition. And then we used an array of speakers to create a spatialized audio experience using, I think we had like 10 subwoofers, so it was a lot. And the choreography here was based on game rules with distinct trajectories. And also the imagery you see here were generated from the dancers' bodies. They're based on biological algorithms. So I throw the data in there and there's an algorithm and then it makes those images. And then the choreography, I use these game rules with distinct trajectories, and they were responding to cues. I call this responsive choreography. They were responding to cues from one another and also from the environment. And each level explored a different complex algorithmic system So Conway's Game of Life, Hebb's Law, Markov's stochastic patterning. The other thing, I guess it's done now, but above the images, there were also 4 Microsoft Connects, and then the audience could also interact with those images. It would change the pattern of those visuals. So the idea was to create like a non-linguistic communication with the audience and to like co-create the performance. So because it was based on game rules, it was like different every time. So so next, I wanted to apply what I learned from Radical and the Body back to my work in social justice and pop culture. So I collaborated on Beware the Dandelions with Complex Movements, a collective from Detroit. And the goal of the immersive theater project was to teach social justice movement building through complex science. This through basically a sci-fi parable. The work integrates data-driven narrative with game-based problem solving, and it's this whole story is communicated through live hip hop lyrics and DJ performance. So the participant players, essentially they're controlling this kind of 3D game engine, which projection mapped onto a 24 by 12-foot sentient pod. So it had like machine vision embedded in it. And the players essentially, they spatially triggered real-time story content consisting of these data visualizations, surveillance cameras, systems communication, embedded clues and puzzles, and embodied social interactions. So they're essentially like tasked with interpreting the flow of nonlinear information through the lyrics to make sense of a narrative in order to act collectively to transform this framework of this AI system, which was kind of like a metaphor for systems of oppression. So, and then the work traveled as both a performance, but also an interactive installation where they had community spaces and like workshops where they would basically be in a community for a month and they would collect stories that would go into this memory map that would travel to the next location. So, yeah, so that's just a little bit of that. The music, it'd probably be nice to hear the music, but for sake of time. Um, so, so I soon realized that at the root of most of the social justice issues that I had been working on was epigenetic trauma, and that our bodies were actually what I saw as like archives of story. Walking Wounded served as both a living lab and a multimedia performance, transforming trauma through movement, sound, and imagery, once again generated from the performers' bodies, like their somatic and autonomic systems. So this time, the first time we built the sensor, we were just looking at somatic data. The second time we fed in some different signals, so we were collecting both autonomic and somatic. So more unconscious things rather than muscle and things of that. So where was I? And then the idea was it was supposed to kind of give expression to these kind of unspeakable personal and collective experiences of trauma by transforming, this kind of like sense of pain and shame, but through bioadaptive play, through like a communal experience. So, yeah. So the piece kind of explored the interplay between ritual and it wanted to bring like a cross-cultural rituals. And the idea was to bring audiences on a journey to this kind of like subterranean underworld of sorts so that they could exercise these kind of signifiers of trauma. So it's very abstracted. And then the idea was that the biotechnology, helped kind of redefine performance and narrative architecture. So, but the main goal is really to kind of restore nonverbal interpersonal connection in a safe environment, foster resilient communities, and bring movement into movement building. So we use these kind of micro performances with local communities. And so the idea originally, I thought I was going to make a piece that would travel, and then I had some ethical quandaries about that because of these personal stories. So I decided to create these like micro performances that would live in community, and also they could invite